I'm Thomas Christensen. I'm just some guy from the internet. I'm currently a student at Saddleback College, and I've had involvement with this piece of legislation. It didn't get passed. It was a ballot initiative that would have allowed private transportation systems, or personal rapid transit, Hyperloop, ET3, maglev, stuff like that. Like private entrepreneurs could build transportation systems, and they would pay the governments to use the right of way, like highways and railways and stuff like that.
My name is James Howard Kunstler. You can call me Jim. I'm the author of about 20-odd books, including The Geography of Nowhere, which is about the suburban project in America and its implications. I'm the author of The Long Emergency, which is about the global resource and capital problems that we face in the 21st century, and Too Much Magic, the subtitle of which is Wishful Thinking, Technology, and the Fate of the Nation, and I hope that's self-explanatory. I'm also the author of about 15 novels, including the World Made by Hand series, which is a series of novels about the post-economic collapse American future.
Okay, that's very interesting. I actually own a copy of The Geography of Nowhere. I haven't had time to read it, but I was going to read it the next chance I get, because I have 20 other books I got to read.
Well, there's going to be a quiz, so you better hurry up.
That's funny. So I'll actually start with topic number 4. This economic paradigm we have, where essentially the economy, I guess, requires a perpetual economic expansion.
Yep. Yeah, that's kind of at odds with what we know about the laws of physics, which also apply to the laws of economics. This is a planet with finite resources,
right?
And we are beginning to bump up against some of them. The main one is, and the main problem is, our primary earthly resource for this era in our history, which is fossil fuels, and mainly oil. And we know that we're bumping up against the limits of affordable oil. In fact, we already have. And we probably passed that threshold in 2003, 4, something like that.
I think it was 2005 when oil...
Well, there are various ways of interpreting it. But
that's when oil hit $105 a barrel, I think.
Well, yes, it's true, but it was going up in the meantime. It didn't overnight get to 105. There's there are various calculations you can use, but a useful one, I think, is just to understand that the infrastructure for our economy, including the banking infrastructure, not just the roads, the highways, and
the power system.
Everything is sort of based on oil that is not much more than $20 a barrel, and we've well exceeded that. Another way of looking at it is the energy return on investment for getting oil out of the ground. In the 1950s, it was something around, between 50 and 100 barrels back for every barrel of oil.
And I think today it's only like 8 or 20, right?
Huh?
For oil, the energy return on investment, right?
If you let me finish the sentence, I'll tell you exactly what it was. In the 1950s, it was about 50 to 100 barrels of oil per barrel that you put into the process of getting it out of the ground.
Okay.
And that's a pretty good return on investment. It's what allowed the tremendous abundance and economic expansion of the early post-war era in the 20th century. Now, the energy return on investment for something like shale oil is about 5 to 1. And that is a problem. The aggregate energy return on investment for all oil now, including shale oil and Arabian, crude and other conventional crudes, the median is about 17 to 1.
Okay.
And it's still pretty low. And so we have a problem with that. And it's giving us some direction. It's telling us that we have to make some changes in our living arrangements, and we're not doing that. we're not interested in paying attention.
Well, something that's related to that, it's not oil, but it's fossil fuels, and it's happening in India.
Oil is a fossil fuel.
Well, no, I said it is fossil fuels, and it said it's not oil, but it's happening in India. They're actually having coal shortages there, believe it or not. They're actually running out of.
Well, some parts of the world have fewer coal deposits than other parts, and it's a commodity, obviously, but you have to swap it around, and if you don't have any, you're at the mercy of the nations that do have it.
Right, and not only that I'm actually writing a paper about this very subject, and that's one of the reasons I did the interview with you. American coal resources, right, the type that people have, that people think are just so abundant, are actually in decline, and the energy content of coal has been declining since 1998. It peaked in 1998, and then it's been on a decline, even though the tonnage has increased.
Yeah, well, we're getting a lower grade of coal out of the ground. The great years of the hard coal anthracite bonanza of Pennsylvania and West Virginia, those days are over.
Yes, they are over. And the coal we get now is harder to get. It has lower energy content. It does more environmental damage because you have to use what's called mountaintop removal. And, that's a problem, because coal is, I would go as far as to say it's even more important than oil because it powers everything. It powers even the extraction of oil. Not
necessarily. Oil powers the extraction of oil, but it's important. I mean, it accounts for about 30% of our electric generation, and 80%
of global electric generation, I think.
Okay.
So if the world peaked on that, which I believe it will soon, because there's still other sources of it like Australia, but if the world peaked, then the world's economies would pretty much collapse. Because the big ones are all dependent on it.
Well, look, we're going to have problems with all of the fossil fuels, right? Natural gas, coal, natural gas liquids, oil, you name it. We're running into limits with all of them, and it's not all that useful to make an enormous distinction between them all. The real question is, what are the new living arrangements we're going to make, and how are we going to make that journey from where we are now to where we're going? And my view of that is it's going to be a rather rocky journey, because we're probably not going to begin down that road until we're suffering some real pain from this. Right.
The easiest thing we could do in the short term is essentially curtail energy consumption to levels comparable to other parts of the world. Maybe
that's one way. That's not my way of looking at it, but that's one way.
Well, I'm just saying that's one thing you could do. I mean, it's not, people probably wouldn't like it, but it's something you could do.
Well, it's obvious. Let's put it this way. That is also self-evident. What's not so self-evident is gets back to what you were saying at the beginning of this phone conversation.
Right.
You were talking about various alternative transportation systems,
right?
Hyperloops and electric cars and PRTs, et cetera, et cetera. We are overly preoccupied with mobility, and we would do much better if we would put more of our attention into the idea of walkable communities. That is, redesigning the places that we live and work so that you don't have to be in a car all the time.
Right.
There are plenty of models for this around the world. In fact, it happens to be the way most of the rest of the world lives.
Right.
But we because of the psychology of previous investment, we've put so much of our national wealth into this suburban infrastructure for daily life that we can't imagine leaving it behind or reforming it or moving away from it or living some other way. And that's a huge psychological problem for the United States. It would, at the same time, be the main means by which we would reduce our energy needs. So that's why it's so important. We're probably not going to reduce our energy needs if we simply keep on living this suburban fiasco that we're in.
Well, right. Well, that is part of it, but another part of it is also just our consumption. Like, for example, like I go to I work in office buildings, and like I've worked for the government for years, and they waste a lot of energy. For example, like they run the lighting 24/7, and there's no need to do that. Just as an example,
there are plenty of things you could look. There are plenty of ways that you could point out that people are wasting energy, but
right.
I don't know what kind of campaign you're going to mount to persuade people to change their behavior. I don't think that government bureaucrats are going to necessarily care that much more about turning out their lights because you're inveighing against it with them.
Okay.
So, it makes much more sense to talk about more fundamental changes that we can make in our living arrangements. And by the way, I wouldn't even take it for granted that the kind of corporate bureaucratic structures that we have presently organized work into are necessarily going to continue the way they are. In fact,
right, like the army would have to be carried out differently if there was like some shortage of petroleum because it's dependent on it.
Everything we do would have to be carried out differently and will be. And there are tremendous implications for the kinds of disruptions that we're going to suffer in the process of getting to that point.
Okay.
Which is another thing I don't think people take seriously enough. The fact that this is probably going to be a very disruptive period of history. There's not going to be a smooth segue or a smooth transition from one state to another. There are going to be many losses of comfort, convenience, investment, value of things. A lot of those things are going to be lost, and it will probably be accompanied by a substantial amount of social disorder. So, it's one thing to kind of hypothesize about if we could only do this and only do that. But there are an awful lot of other implications to what we're talking about. And, it's going to, I didn't call my book The Long Emergency for nothing. It will entail a lot of difficulty.
Right. I think, to bring up some more data, right, if I'm not mistaken, I heard that Indonesia, will run out of petroleum. They'll just run out of the resource in about 12 years.
Well, that's very likely. They have an enormous population, and their own oil industry peaked in its production probably 15, 20 years ago.
Right. I think it peaked in the 1970s or 80s. I could be wrong on that.
Well, I think it was a little later, but it doesn't matter. It's past the Indonesian oil industry, which was a substantial industry. It was, after all, the beginning of Royal Dutch Shell, which is now Shell Oil. They have an enormous population in their country, too. It's, one of the most populous countries in the world.
I think it has like 100 million people. It's huge.
At least. So it's not surprising that they're going to run into problems. They no longer have oil to really export enough, and so they're simply cannibalizing their own oil supply, and they'll use it up, until it's probably gone. And then you'll see some tremendous social problems.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one thing that peak oil could do, is it could bring a lot of problems to these Islamic countries, because that's the main industry for many of them.
I don't think there's any question it will.
I mean, it's already brought problems to Egypt. That's why the whole Arab Spring, I think, happened.
Well, I think you can safely say it has created massive problems across the entire Middle East, North African region.
Right, and Central Asia, too, because they also depend on that.
Well, Central Asia is not in as much of a state of turmoil as the Middle East is. If you're talking about Kazakhstan and
right. Kazakhstan is an oil-producing country, I think.
Right, it's a major oil producer, but it is not it's not in the same condition as the.
Well, obviously, I'm more talking like in the long term, like maybe in the next 10 or 20 years or so.
Oh, sure, it's very possible and likely that countries that have gotten used to a lot of income from their oil supplies when it's suddenly gone, they're going to see social problems because naturally, on the basis of their oil revenue, they made promises to the population that they're not going to be able to keep.
Okay, well, what's your take on this whole idea? Like, I think it's just retarded. People say, "Oh, that's a defensive term," but like it is, and like this idea that we're going to have like robot socialism and everything's going to be automated and it's all going to be amazing. I think
that's why I wrote a book called Too Much Magic,
right,
about wishful thinking and technology. I think what we're seeing out there is something a state of mind that I call techno-narcissism. An excessive and obsessive belief in our own technological wondrousness. And it's going to get us in a lot of trouble. I'd personally be very worried about artificial intelligence and anything that emanates out of that, including robotics. And but I tend to think that we're going to suffer an economic collapse before we get to that, and that this economic collapse will kind of put the kibosh on a lot of the pernicious activities that are going on now.
Right. Well, yeah, it's an idea that a lot of people believe that essentially, we're gonna like robots are gonna replace all human labor, and then it's all gonna then we're all gonna essentially then we'll essentially have a form of socialism because there won't be any jobs.
It's a simple-minded idea, and it's basically dumb.
I know. It's very common. That's why I brought it up. It's a very common idea.
Well, a lot of common ideas are simple-minded.
Yeah.
And
okay.
That's one of them.
And then there just becomes the problem of like, what are people going to do with their lives?
Well, that's already a problem. I'd say that we're having a tremendous problem in the United States with purposefulness and with people's sense of having some meaningful role to play in their society. It's already an enormous problem. If it wasn't, you wouldn't see people running around with tattoos and nose rings and
dressed like goths or emos.
Yeah, dressed in weird costumes and indulging in opioids and
trannyism.
Kind of behavior. Yeah, I think a lot of the behavior you're seeing out there is indicative of a tremendous feeling of a lack of purpose.
Right. That would be a problem. Then the other problem I would see with this model is you technically can't, even if there was no problems of energy scarcity, which there absolutely is, even if it wasn't an issue, you can't automate everything. You still need human labor at some part of the way. And then what are you going to do with those people? Are you going to force them? Are you going to coerce them into running all the infrastructure?
We don't know what we're going to do, and we haven't even thought through the hypotheticals. I think that hypothetically it's much more plausible that the human population is going to go down a lot in the next 100 years, simply because we have exceeded the carrying capacity of the Earth for the things that we do. So it then becomes a question of how messy and unappetizing and unpleasant that particular journey is.
Right. Well, I would have to say maybe I'd be in disagreement with you there, but the Earth's population will probably decline, if you will, by reduced birth rates, most likely.
Well, I mean, sure.
I mean that may go.
That's one way. It's not the only way.
Well, that is how it's declining, like in Japan and other places.
I think what you're going to see is this: that even in periods of economic hardship, people will continue to have sex, and
right.
Sex will continue to produce babies. But the babies they produce are liable to not thrive once they arrive here. And,
there's birth control and stuff like that in this day and age.
Yeah, we're not going to have any policy about limiting births. It simply can't be controlled. That's not going to happen. It's an idle wish. But nature will have its way with us, and nature will tell us what we can expect to do in the way of human reproduction, and that's pretty much how it's going to go, in my opinion.
Okay, well, I guess I would just have to disagree with you there. I just, the Earth's birth rate is a half of what it was 50 years ago. Like for example, the Earth's birth rate in 1960 was about 5.0. Today it's about 2.5, and is steadily declining.
Well, we're still growing the population.
Well, right, that's because of reduced mortality rates.
Well, all right. Look, this is an anomalous moment in history. We're really about to leave one economic paradigm behind and enter a new one, about which we don't know that much.
Okay.
And we can speculate and hypothesize about it, but we really don't know quite exactly what's going to be going on. So my hypothesis is that the journey to that new economy and that the culture that goes with it is going to be a rocky journey, because it's going to involve so much competition for resources and so much loss and so much bad feeling about the things that are lost. And at the same time, we'll see a natural decline in population simply because people will not be thriving under extremely adverse economic circumstances.
Okay. I mean, yeah, like I know there's some like right wingers who complain about, I guess, the third world population expansion. Well, maybe they'll get their wish and that'll come to an end.
Well, I'm not wishing for,
I'm not saying you are. I'm saying they are.
Who's they, and what exactly are they wishing for, in your opinion?
They, I guess, would be, like white nationalists. Essentially, they worry about, I guess, Africa's population growing too much. If we don't
have to concern ourselves with them. Look, this problem is going to concern everybody. And,
okay.
It's not just a matter of racism, white nationalism.
I know. I'm just thinking, like, maybe they'll if that really did happen, maybe they'd get what they want without having to do anything.
The white nationalists?
Yeah,
I don't know.
You get the third world population decline without having to do anything about that. So
let me put it this way: white nationalists will have plenty of problems of their own, just like everybody else. So
okay,
it's not like they're going to be sitting in some special luxury box on the sidelines watching it all.
Okay. See, the best thing I think we could do to just have power, not even to consume it at current levels, but to just simply have it, and so that it could still be used for something, like having phone calls, like what we do requires electricity, like what we're doing right now. Mm-hmm. I like having the internet and those things, and I think those things are useful and valuable things. So to retain that, the best we could do, I think, is just nuclear power.
Well, there are other people who have that opinion, and it may be the only way that we can keep the lights on.
Right.
There are tremendous problems that go along with that, and one of them is that we have no idea how we're going to retire these nuclear power plants that have reached the end of their design life. That's a problem for us right now. We also don't know what would happen in an emergency where, for one reason or another, the electricity were to be, the grid were to shut down for some reason. Whether it was something called a Carrington event, which is an electromagnetic pulse from the sun of a certain kind that tends to destroy electrical systems because it's so harsh. Or an EMT warfare incident, which is kind of the same thing but induced artificially by human weapons, or some other accident. So if that happens, you have to be very concerned about the nuclear reactor cores all over the United States melting down.
Well, I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's pretty much what we got. I mean, it's
true. It's the only power thing that we have that has some prospect of taking us beyond fossil fuel.
Right. I think the best, most feasible one, and from doing research,
the other problem with it is that it's enormously expensive.
Right.
And one of the features of the period that we're moving into, which is the post-cheap oil period, is that the lack of cheap oil has a direct dynamic relationship with money, banking, and credit. And what it basically means is that the credit is not going to be there, that our ability to generate more debt to take care of these problems is not going to be there for us as we move further into that period. And so we're going to have even less financial resources than we did before. And that says to me that, if we don't have the resources now to build nuclear plants or the political will to do it, we're not going to have it in the future.
Well, I mean, like I said, the way I see it is if we want any power at all, not even consuming it at current levels, right? Pretty much we'd have to consume a half or a third of what we consume right now. If we want any power, then that's pretty much our option, other than maybe geothermal or hydroelectric. But those are what actually works. Like solar and wind power can't scale up.
Well, now that you mentioned scale, the word scale is probably the most important word for talking about this rather clouded future that we face. And a lot of the chatter about the future seems to be based on the assumption that most of the things that we do are going to remain at the scale that we're doing them now. And I would argue that that is exactly what's not going to happen. It's exactly a scale issue. We cannot run the industrial farming, industrial food production system the way we've been running it and the way we're comfortable with it, based on the economics of what we're facing. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that we're going to have to have smaller farms that require more human attention. They're going to have to be distributed better in the landscape. And it also suggests that places where we're doing industrial farming might fail, especially places out in the drier parts of the American plains where we are depleting the aquifers. So if we can't produce food, of course, at the scale that we're producing it now, you're definitely going to see very significant impacts on human population. So my guess is that, all the things we're doing now, whether it's commerce, in other words, shopping and making things and selling things, shopping or education or farming or medicine or any of the systems that we've erected are probably going to have to be conducted on a more modest and less complex scale than we're now seeing. And we're not thinking about that a whole lot.
Okay. Well, a very simple thing that could be done, you've talked about the passenger railroad system. Well, one thing you could do is you could get rid of a lot of the regulations that hinder them, like get rid of the Federal Railroad Administration.
Yes, you could help things along a lot by getting rid of a lot of bad regulations.
You wouldn't even need to spend any money. Like that would cost us $0.00, and we could do that.
You could get rid of a lot of bad rules and regs and laws and also to pass something similar to the legislation that I proposed in California, and just allow private entrepreneurs to build transportation systems, whatever they may be, so that, because realistically, I don't see the government building any of these things, whatever it may be. But if you allowed the market to work, then maybe we could at least have something. Well, hypothetically, maybe. But as I said, our tendency for the moment is to go overboard with transportation planning, because we can't imagine rearranging our daily lives on the landscape. And, I would go back to what I said before. We'll get much more value out of rearranging our daily lives on the landscape. Well, I'm not disagreeing with it. I'm just saying that is something we could, because I do think there is a need for transportation. It's just that it should be provided in a way that's sustainable and also based on market demands, because we subsidize all of the forms of transportation and we overutilize it because of that. Sure.
And they're all pretty much terribly run. Like Amtrak is terrible, and the interstate highway system is terrible. So the best thing we could do, I think, is just bring back markets to a certain extent. And I'm not a market fundamentalist. Like, I'm not a free market fundamentalist, but in this area, the government has screwed up badly.
Well, yeah, and I especially harp on the railroad because that's an infrastructure that is already pretty much still there, although it very badly needs to be updated and fixed. But the main thing that has been there all along are the right-of-ways, that were established when this was a much more sparsely populated country. To go back now and to acquire new rights-of-way and acquire new properties would probably be an impediment too big to get over. And that's one of the reasons why I think that we're not going to be able to build a high-speed rail system in the United States, but we would get a lot of benefit from refurbishing the existing conventional railroad system. And people would be delighted to be able to get from New York City to Chicago at 100 miles an hour on trains that leave on time and arrive on time. It's not such a terribly difficult thing to do, but the state of the railroad now is so terrible that it's really not possible. Especially, that New York to Chicago trip. One of the things that happened because of a bunch of stupid laws in New York State was that the New York Central Railroad was acquired by CSX, the freight company, and we had a special real estate tax on railroad rights-of-way that was put in around the 1880s or 90s when there was a lot of animosity against the railroads in the state legislature. And so in order to get rid of their tax burden, CSX just destroyed one whole line of tracks along the New York Central right-of-way. And what that means now is that there isn't a second track, that the passenger trains all have to step aside on a siding to let the freight trains through. And they're constantly having to do that. And it delays the journey from New York to Chicago by hours. And it's very unpredictable, and they can't leave on time and arrive on time. And it ends up being a system that nobody wants to use because it's so badly run and badly...
Right. I once took an Amtrak train. It was from San Luis Obispo to I think, San Juan Capistrano, and there was a 6-hour delay there, like literally 6 hours wait time, additional on top of the time it takes to usually get there, which is about 8 hours. So it made an 8-hour trip into a 14-hour trip.
Yeah, I took an Amtrak years ago in the 70s from New York City to Oakland, California, and we sat on a siding in Denver all the livelong day for no good reason that was ever explained to us, when we just sat there for like 10 hours. And
right,
that's how we roll.
Well, a better example was in Florida. It's called Brightline, or was originally called All Aboard, and they've built it recently, and it was built with private money, and that was built under today's regulatory environment. If you had a better one, I'm sure you could have more things like that.
Well, sure. No, I would agree with you that if you improve the regulatory environment and make it sane and rational,
I would just require railroads to have full liability. That any damages they cause, they have to be fully liable for them, and that would deal with most of the problems railroads may or may not cause.
Okay.
So that's just an idea I had. And you brought up the right-of-ways. The legislation I told you about, where you could build like a Hyperloop or a PRT or an ET3 or whatever, it would use existing right-of-ways like highways and things like that. You could rent them from the government, because the government owns all the highways. You would pay the government a certain amount of money, and then you would have a right to use the right-of-way.
I've never been clear how the PRT is really substantially different from just calling it Uber.
Oh, well, okay, I'll explain the differences to you because this is something I've
seen schematic demonstrations of.
No. Let me explain to you. A PRT, it's sort of like the advantages would be it requires less weight to move a person. It's less weight than existing passenger trains or a car. It takes about a ton to move a person. It would take less weight to do that because of the weight of the vehicles. And the infrastructure is fairly cheap at around $5 to $15 million a kilometer, which is much less expensive than light rail or other sorts of infrastructure. And the advantage to it over an Uber or an electric car is you have the lower coefficient of friction. Like a steel wheel on steel rails or maglevs have a lower coefficient of friction, like less rolling resistance.
Yeah, I understand that. I think that you end up with a bunch of economic hair splitting that may not really make that much difference. And it kind of gets back to my original point, which is, we're kind of masturbating about transportation when we should be doing more to build walkable communities that are more pleasant and rewarding to live in.
Well, like I said, I don't disagree with you there. I just think that there is a need for some sort of transportation system.
Yeah, there is. I just don't think the PRT is going to do it. I don't personally believe that the cost of it is. I don't think it's going to be affordable. It involves a lot of fixed infrastructure, and
they built one in Morgantown, and it actually returns a profit every 5 years.
Yeah, I think there are certain places where you can do things like that. I think you can do PRT type things in certain places for special reasons. The one in West Virginia is tied into basically to a university system that moves a lot of people around. It's the same dynamic that you see in these small town shopping, Main Street shopping malls that have taken closed them down to car traffic and turned them into pedestrian malls. Those things have proved to be a complete failure in every setting except the university towns, where there are enormous numbers of captive pedestrians who will use a system like that. So it's a special solution to a particular need that is not going to translate to every town in America.
Okay.
And only to a small minority of them.
Well, the main use I would say for it is just maybe areas with less population density. Not every place has the density to support a passenger train.
Yeah, well, we'll see how that works out. Not every place is the same, and they have different needs, and there are different ways of moving people around, and we'll see what we can afford and what's realistic and what we can do.
Right, and that's why I think the best thing you can do is just regulatory reform on a federal level and passing legislation similar to the one I helped to get passed, that I tried to get passed. I didn't get it passed. I tried to help it get passed. Unfortunately, it never got on the ballot, but that would be the best thing I think you could do there. It's just,
try.
Just essentially deal with the fact that the governments don't have that much money to spend on infrastructure.
Yeah, I agree. And they will have less money to spend on it as time goes on.
Like Trump wants this whole infrastructure plan. It's just not going to happen.
I tend to think that it probably won't. If they do it, it'll have to all be done with borrowed money. And if we continue to borrow money at the rate that we have been, we're going to end up with too many debts that we're not able to pay back, and we'll probably destroy our currency and our banking system in the process. Like
they want, I think it was called public-private partnerships. And in reality, I don't think that would work. It's better off just essentially, you'd have to essentially allow the market to produce the transportation infrastructure that it can economically support.
Yeah, well, it remains to be seen, but certainly the phrase public-private partnerships has become kind of an anodyne cliche that politicians throw around because it sounds good. But,
right.
Actually making sure
it's shiny
is another matter.
One form of urban development that I think could be brought back on a larger scale I mentioned, we talked about it before actually, was the townhome, right? The row house with, they call them brownstones, I think.
Well, there's such a thing in the field of urban design as building typologies. And in fact, there are types of all kinds of things. There are types of streets. There are types of buildings. There are even types of cities. There are types of neighborhoods and districts. All kinds of types of things. And there are many types of urban buildings that are more suitable to compact living arrangements. Anyone who has gone to a European city or even a European small town will understand what I'm talking about.
Right, I've been to both.
There, pardon me?
I've been to both actually.
Yeah. So then that too is self-evident that if you're going to live in a more compact human habitat, you have to find a different kind of container to put the homes in. And many of the kinds that we know are very satisfactory. They're not exactly the same as having a split level on a quarter-acre lot, but they can be very satisfying, especially if they're in a city that uses some artistry in its composition and development and assembly. So there are plenty of places in Europe where people live in apartments. They're not necessarily cramped little apartments. They may be spacious apartments. But a lot of their daily life and their daily living takes place in the public realm of the town. Whether it's the coffee shop or the bistro or the park or the streets or wherever. And that is exactly what you find when you go to Paris. You find a tremendous amount of the life of the city taking place in public places. And in America, we have a kind of impoverishment of public space and an aggrandizement of private space, so that you have, the average home has more bathrooms per inhabitant than any other land on Earth. But our public space is mingy and stingy and poorly thought out, and there's not that much of it, especially as you get out into the more suburban parts of America.
Okay. I was in San Luis Obispo last year, and they actually built a bunch of modern brownstones that are actually fairly decent. They're not the best. There's better ones, but they come pretty close to what they used to look like.
Yeah, well, we haven't done that kind of building in a long time, and the skill that's needed to execute them and even design them has got to become, pretty much reinvented, because we've forgotten how to do most of this stuff. And another problem is that the habits and practices of the building industry are such that they've developed so many shortcuts that their economic model depends on, that you end up with basically lower quality buildings that are not rewarding for people to be in. So, the workings of the real estate industry and the way they intersect with our taxing policies and the manipulation of interest rates by the Federal Reserve and all kinds of other dynamics have made the housing market basically insane.
Right. I mean, like here, like the average, like an affordable house here would be like $500,000.
Right.
Like in Southern California. I mean, there's some more less expensive places, but that's pretty much what you can get. And that's another problem with the system, especially with big urban areas, is they're just, lots of places have just become unaffordable.
Well, they are at the moment, for reasons that have to do with probably what I would call the financialization of the economy has created a lot of perversities and distortions in our daily life. There are going to probably be violent readjustments from those distortions, and these will entail a lot of losses for people who are investors or people who bought houses because they thought that they could flip them or that they were going to, just use that as a storage for their wealth. That whole situation is going to get pretty I think, surprising for people.
Another thing that I really liked about European cities was the streets are very small. They're much more narrower.
Well, yes, they're the people who really understand urban design understand that there's a relationship between the heights of the buildings and the width of the streets. And if you make the streets too wide and the buildings too low, you're not going to create the sense of being in an outdoor public room, which is what a street is at its best. And if you're going to do stupid things like eliminate on-street parking against the curb, you're going to promote people to treat the street like it's an interstate highway and drive faster. So when you go to a place like downtown Minneapolis, where the streets are excessively wide and there is limited on-street parking, you find that the cars are all going 40, 50 miles an hour, where there should be people all around. But, of course, people don't want to be in that environment, so there aren't that many people around. And, you see this continually in American cities all over, and it's just another expression of the kind of insanity and stupidity that we've driven ourselves into, and the bad choices that we've made in this incredible era of energy abundance.
Right. It really was, as you said, the greatest misallocation of resources in the history of the world. Is that right?
That's right.
Maybe I didn't quote exactly, but that's a summary of what you said. Okay. Yeah. So it is a great misallocation of resources, and I think, and not just from an energy consumption point of view, but just from the perspective of we could build places that are better.
Well, absolutely. And by that, what do we mean by better? Well, more rewarding to the human spirit. The reason I use the word artistry when I'm talking about our everyday surroundings is that artistry is our main means for interfering with the law of physics called entropy. Entropy is that force in nature that drives things towards stasis and death, and it's a constant presence in our life. And we're always sort of trying to fight against entropy in order to keep the quality of human life at an acceptable level. And one of the strategies for doing that is to design the human habitat, our everyday world, with true artistry, so that it rewards your spirits, so that it tells you that you ought to be grateful to be here, that you're privileged to be in this place. That if you're walking down a street in Paris, you're privileged to be in that beautiful setting. And in America, we don't give a shit about that, and it shows. It ends up being reflected in a population that's extremely demoralized, that's anxiety-ridden, that lacks a sense of purpose, and is in many other ways psychologically damaged. So you can't understate the damage. You can't overstate the damage that we're doing, or overstate the need for some purposeful, conscious artistry in the design and assembly of the places that we live.
Right, like when I went to Madrid, it was a much more beautiful city than the majority of American cities I've been to.
Of course.
Like the architecture was like I really liked the architecture and how they designed all the squares, like how there were street cafes rather than just Starbuckses.
Well, that's a programming issue, not necessarily an architectural issue. And people get very confused about that. They don't know the difference between what we were talking about earlier, building typologies, and the activities that go on inside of them. You can have a really beautiful street in Madrid, and it may have a Starbucks on the corner. But that Starbucks on the corner is in a 19th century building that was beautifully designed, and it has had many other businesses on that corner before Starbucks was there, and it will have many businesses afterwards after Starbucks is gone. And Starbucks doesn't do that much damage to the life of the city with its programming. However, if you build Starbucks in a standalone building in the middle of a parking lot, and the building looks like a clown jumping up and down, then you're going to harm the psychology of your culture.
Okay, interesting. One thing I noticed about Spain, like I was in Santander, which was kind of like a poorer sort of city, but it wasn't too bad. There was just much less social alienation in Spain. People talked to each other more and interacted with each other more.
Well, there are places that have. Let's not forget, there are places that have great urban design that still end up having terrible political and social problems. So it's not as though great urban design is the panacea for everything, but it helps a lot. I mean, they had great urban design in Berlin in 1934, and they got Hitler. And we have shitty urban design in America, and we got John F. Kennedy in 1960. So you can still have problems, but it certainly helps to I think to the everyday life of a culture to dwell in a place and dwell in places, plural, that are rewarding to the human spirit and not just something you have to put up with.
Well, I'm not necessarily dealing with the politics per se. That's a whole nother issue unto itself. But I think that's one of the reasons why we have social alienation isn't just simply because we have smartphones and computers. Like other parts of the world have those things, and they don't really have that problem. Mm-hmm. Like in Spain, like I think the urban design, helps facilitate social interaction, I guess I would say.
I would agree with you completely. It does, and I think you can't also overstate the kind of loneliness and alienation that you find in the American scene.
Like people use things like smartphones and stuff like that because they're alienated, because they don't have purpose or friends or whatever.
Well, I think that you could construct an argument along those lines that, the kids are on smartphones because it's hard for them to get around their environment. Most American suburban environments are not very friendly to children who don't have a driver's license. They can't navigate their everyday world without assistance from the family chauffeur, mom.
Right.
And a lot of kids who are 13 years old don't want to be with mom all the time. They don't want to have to depend on mom schlepping them around. That was the difference. Now, for example, in my childhood, it just happened that I grew up in the middle of Manhattan in New York City. For whatever reason, that was my world. I didn't have to depend on my parents for anything. I could get on the subway when I was 11 years old and go up to Yankee Stadium and be there in 15 minutes and buy myself a ticket. And the only thing I couldn't do was buy a beer. But I could enjoy the life of the city, in that case, the sporting life of the city. And that worked out fine. And that's what you see in Europe, where, kids can use their environment. They're not foreclosed from it. And one of the interesting consequences of that when you're in Europe is that, older children more than 10 years old in Europe, appear to be much more mature in their comportment in public. They don't run around screaming. They're not, being aggressive and violent with each other. And you go out into a piazzetta in Italy at 8:00 in the evening, when the sun is going down in September, and it's a beautiful night, and you see people of all ages in the plaza, and they may be standing in their own groups, or the 13-year-olds are talking to the 13-year-olds, and the 75-year-olds are with their peers, but still they're all in the same place, and they all evince norms of behavior that cross age categories. So, I think that what we're talking about, in short, is civilized behavior, and civilized behavior is promoted by good urban design.
Right. So that was one thing I enjoyed about Spain was the good urban design, or not just the big cities, but also the villages. Like a lot of the villages have become kind of touristy, but the architecture and buildings are still there. You still have those beautiful old villages with those old. It's still a very civic sort of place. It isn't just a bunch of houses. It's just a very compact civic place with stone streets, and Podes, I think it was called, was quite a beautiful village in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
And if you ever get the chance to, I'd recommend going to Spain. It's quite beautiful.
Oh, I've been to Spain. I haven't been to Madrid, but I've been to Barcelona.
Okay.
And Barcelona's a lovely place.
So yeah, like you mentioned how you need a car to go anywhere. Well, California is probably the worst in that regard.
My observations, having been in California a gazillion times, and having lived there for one summer when I was a child, and for a year and a half when I was a young adult, my observation was that it's pretty poorly designed for the most part.
Oh yeah, it's sort of like a never-ending suburb.
Well, that's exactly what it is, except for parts of San Francisco and a few parts of Los Angeles, and.
Well, if you go down the I-5 freeway, it's pretty much like a never-ending sort of band of development. Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, I agree.
Well, this has been a very good show. Do you have any final comments?
Well, only that I think we're facing a period in our history, in American history, that's going to be very challenging. I think there are going to be a lot of fights over how we make this journey I've talked about, and I hope we can successfully navigate our way to a more sane way of being civilized.
Right, and I would agree with you there. And I think just some basic things we can do is just to change the legislation for all the various things that we do, so that maybe we could have something that works. In the event,
I support that.
In the event that we don't have anything, in the event that we don't have any coal, natural gas, oil, or whatever, just so that we have some form of transportation and power. Even if it's much smaller, way smaller.
Oh, I'll buy that.
This is Thomas Christensen. Interviewed James Howard Kunstler. It was a very interesting discussion. Maybe we can call again some other time, but I very much enjoyed it. And have a lovely day. I have to get going as well.
Okay, thank you very much, and you have a good day too, Tom.
See you later.
Bye-bye.